Thank you all for being here this morning. We're very excited today to have a very special guest at a very timely time to talk about United States agriculture trade policy. First off, I just want to say thank you to Keeneland for hosting this event. I really do appreciate this, and the Undersecretary ought to do is go next door to the sales pavilion to see the impact of international trade on a signature industry in Kentucky with our thoroughbred industry. I also want to say thank you to Kentucky Farm Bureau and Mr. Beck and his crew for being here, for helping host, as well as the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, Commerce Lex. I'd like to say welcome to Brian Lacefield with the Farm Service Agency, and Hilda Legg of Rural Development could not be here, but her staff is here as well as World Trade Center Kentucky, Alltech, and I believe Ms. Stephanie Nelson is here from Leader McConnell's office as well. Thank you all for being here this morning. International trade. Agriculture is completely dependent on access to foreign markets. The American farmer, and more importantly, the Kentucky farmer, is so efficient at what they do that we depend upon selling our products outside of the United States to be successful. And here in Kentucky, we have a lot of quality agriculture products. We have a story to tell when I get to travel. If you go around the world and you ask who the most famous Kentuckian of them all is, some would say Abraham Lincoln, some would say George Clooney, but the most famous Kentuckian of them all is Colonel Sanders. And when you talk about Kentucky abroad, what other agriculture products come to mind? Obviously, bourbon, racehorses. We have a little race every May at the other track. But every day is the Kentucky Derby here at Keeneland. And of course, we're known for having value behind our agricultural products. And so we're so excited today to have the Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Ted McKinney, with us today. He's been a friend of mine and, more importantly, a mentor of mine. He's from Indiana. We'll not hold that against you, at least for now. He was nominated by President Trump in July of 2017 to be the first Undersecretary for Trade and Agricultural Affairs, a newly created position a few years ago that sat empty. So we're so proud that we have someone on the front lines, literally traveling the world to promote American agriculture. Before that, he spent 19 years at Dow AgroSciences, 14 years with Elanco, a subsidiary of Eli Lilly, and he's been a chief policy advisor with the Trump campaign, and we both served on the Agriculture Advisory Board for the Trump campaign in 2016. Then most recently, he served as the director of the Department of Agriculture for Indiana. That's where we met. But he has Kentucky roots. His family originally came from Lincoln County at McKinney Junction. And so a little town named after his family. He travels a lot. He traveled 100,000 miles in 1 month promoting American agriculture. We're glad that you chose Kentucky, but the first question I have is, he's a Purdue grad. If given a choice to cheer between Indiana, IU, and Kentucky, who would you cheer for?
Oh, that's difficult. Well, I'd probably flip a coin, but I tell you, my roots in Boilermaker country and the heated competition between Purdue and IU is not unlike Kentucky and Louisville. So I don't know. I'd probably give a nod today to Kentucky. How's that?
Go Big Blue. That's right. All right. The floor is yours. You'd like to have it.
Okay. Well, listen. Thank you all very much. You may wonder how in the world I got here. I learned that I am rivaled in the USDA by one person in their fanaticism for FFA, and that would be Secretary Perdue. So he'd been there for several months, and we got there, and his staff was already at work signing several of us to go out to different state conventions. And so they said, well, where do you want to go? And I said, well, I know the Midwest pretty well. And I said, I particularly know Kentucky and Indiana because of the alternating conventions that we had there for a while on the national convention. So, and I also thought I knew Ryan. I'd love to get back there. So I was lucky to be assigned Kentucky. And the first thing I did is called Ryan and said, hey, let's double down and have one of these kinds of events in addition to being at the convention. So that's great. Folks, I'm grateful to be back out here. I tell you, there are real people in Washington, let me just say it, but it is true that sometimes you can get caught in a bubble, and so when you can come out and talk to real people that are running real businesses and are the closest to the marketplace, at least the production marketplace that we know, it's just such a good feeling. So genuinely from the heart and the head both, it's great to be here. I won't get into too many things because I want to let the questions dictate those, but I will say that I do think we're at a very, very fascinating time that many case studies will be written over about what I call right-sizing or making adjustments in trade. And I suspect there is a lot of anxiety out there with you, particularly, after the last 48 hours where we have 232 tariffs countered on many of our ag products, and that's by big, important, good trading partners like Mexico and Canada. And as you probably know, I just got back from China 2 nights ago, and that was a very worthwhile trip. But there's been a lot going on with China as well, and over the last few decades, not all of it positive. So all I can say is it's not fair for me over the last 20 years to be complaining about the slippery slope of non-tariff trade barriers and the U.S. getting screwed on trade where we have our markets pretty much wide open, low tariffs. If you meet the goals on food safety and equivalency and livestock and poultry, bring it on in. We are free traders for the most part. But it is not that way around the world. And a adjustment, a right-sizing, a fix-it, you use your own descriptor, is probably time and maybe even long overdue. And that's what we're going through. When I was going through my Senate confirmation hearing, not one but 2 senators asked, what would I like to affect? What change would I like to leave? It wasn't quite what's your legacy, but it was getting at that. And I said, well, if there's one thing I could work on, it's to stop this slippery slope of non-tariff trade barriers. And by that I mean countries saying, well, we believe in the safety of those GMOs, but consumers are really concerned, so we're just not going to allow it. Or if we have a high-path avian flu ban and we fix it, and I mean we really fix it, but the ban continues on the export of our poultry. And what can I say about how long it took to get beef back in after the mad cow issue where one cow in the West Coast had mad cow? Now, I could go long. I know firsthand, we had a scientist, a colleague of mine, I did not know him, at Dow AgroSciences. He's in jail now. He was passing along all the new secrets on crop protection chemistries to foreign country. Not 20 miles away from that, a really good feed company pulled one of their employees off. He had in his possession on a one-way ticket all the new enzymes that was the future of their company. So we have a lot to fix. And it probably would have been folly for us to have thought that it would have been an easy thing to say to many countries, would you please stop doing that? And then not have to have some form of enforcement and then not feel some pain in return. And I think that's what we're doing. Do I believe that President Trump has our back? Yes, I do. I absolutely do. I know that from firsthand experience. I know it from my former boss, a guy named Pence. I know it from Secretary Perdue, who sits in on those meetings. So we're going to have to be patient. But I do also believe the president when he said, I'm not going to let agriculture be the tip of the spear and suffer the consequences of, my words here, right-sizing what we're doing on trade. Because we all knew, and we told them, that agriculture would be the big left roundhouse hook in retaliation. All they got to do is look at red counties on a big U.S. map and say, oh, sure, let's pick products there. And that's about as easy as it comes. So I'm thrilled to be here. I want to answer your questions. There is good news out there, and I want to get that across to you. And so let's just get into Q&A, Ryan.
That's great. I've got a few questions, and be thinking about what you want to ask the Undersecretary. We'd like to make sure we have questions from the audience here shortly. A couple things. What is the Trump's administration's vision on trade in general?
Sure. It's very simple. And it's true. Free, fair, and reciprocal trade. Now, his campaign, of course, led with an America first, make America great again. And he was not incorrect on that. I think since then they have added clarity to say, we're not about selfishness here. We can't possibly do it. 95% of the world lives outside of the U.S., so we have to export. So he knows that, and he knows that with so many other things. We hear a lot about autos, for example. But free, fair, and reciprocal trade, and each of those has a lot packed in each of those words. It's that simple.
You mentioned China earlier. That's the country probably getting the most press right now. We hear a lot. We've heard a lot these last couple months. I think that there's a lot of anxiety out there about the relationship with China, particularly as it affects our agricultural goods. What's the latest?
Yeah. Well, we spent last week there. Let's see. Got in Wednesday, and we started meetings Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday was when Secretary Ross came, and they were more formal at higher levels. The good news is that we continue to converse, and the conversations are free-flowing. They are candid, but they're not mean-spirited. You know, there's no pounding the table or meanness. And if you can have conversations like that, it's a good thing because it means that you're making progress. And we did make progress. We made progress in agriculture and energy. And I do not know the figure that I saw in the Indianapolis Star about 70 billion in trade. I don't know what the energy piece of the equation was, but we made progress. I think the question is, did we make enough progress? And the answer is probably not. And let me explain. It's easy to make a promise. And we've heard promises over the last many, many years from China. And many of those fizzle. The 100-day plan after the president was elected made many promises, most which did not materialize. So I hope you can understand and appreciate that we're very much into a trust but verify. Where have you heard that before? And see where it goes. So I don't think this is done yet. I know there are no follow-up exchanges planned, but I'll tell you the Chinese on the ag front did make some commitments that we're following up on. Some commitments were as early as a week out. Some were as early as 2 weeks out. Some at the 1 month, and some at the 2 point, and then 2 month, and then several others several months out. So as long as we're allowed, we're going to continue working with them and see if there is evidence that they mean what they say. But it does not mean you relieve the pressure. Because the moment you do that, time and time and time again, evidence has shown that we go back to normal and you get the frustrations and you lose all leverage. So I was encouraged that they offered some things. They seem to be serious. I'll take them at their word, but we're going to validate that through these next few weeks and months of proof points, if I can use that word.
A lot of soybeans are in the ground right now. Our farmers are committed for the 18 grow season. They're waiting anxiously to see what's going to happen. China buys about $14 billion worth of soybeans. They buy about 16% of all U.S. agricultural exports. What other markets do we have for soy if there are some disruptions with the Chinese import market?
Yeah, well, I would say none that rank in the size of China. So if you're looking for me to list 1 or 2 or 6 countries that rival China, they're not there. China is that large. I mean, every other row of soybeans across the U.S. goes to China. And they do need them. Now, I anticipate that they'll still need to buy some because Brazil and Argentina just cannot supply all the need. So I think there will be continued some flow, but we don't want to be the secondary market. We want to ship it right out of our ports, mostly from this area, New Orleans, and ship it direct as opposed to having a secondary market and rerouting it through some other country. I'll say this, though. One of my strategies is the leave no stone unturned strategy. It is not just by chance that my first trade mission, 2 weeks after being sworn in, was to India. And we've been to Guatemala. and we're going to Indonesia and Vietnam. I'm going to drop into Myanmar. We'll drop down into the the South American countries as well. I've been to the UK. And folks, there's business to be had out there. Now, not for a moment will I suggest that we have taken our major markets for granted. We have not. Canada, Mexico, Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, all major markets. And I think the U.S., with our commodity groups and government, have done right by those. But boy, when you come into times like this, it makes you wonder, has your strategy been right? You know, should you have been tougher 10 years ago? I don't know. I'm not going to second guess that, except to say that we are flat after opening new markets. Let me give you an example. And this is not so much a soy example, but it makes the point. We were in the northern triangle of Central America. The trade mission was in Guatemala. So I'm thinking, okay, good country. We've got a free trade agreement there with CAFTA. Holy smokes, all-time high in the numbers of companies that wanted to go down and do business. Alltech was there, Monica represented you guys well. All-time high in the number of companies that wanted to go see about business opportunity, and all-time high in business conducted in Guatemala. Who'd have thunk it? I wouldn't have. And by the way, we had what we do is we ask at the end of the day, and companies do speed dating kinds of discussions. That's what happens. They match up companies there that want to buy, companies here that want to sell, and sometimes sales go both ways. But at the end, we ask our businesses to conservatively estimate, what do you think the business is you'll do over the next 12 months? Two companies were so through the roof, we had to discard them to validate if they really understood the question. Conservative, not conservative. And so even when we discarded those two, it was the number 3 all-time. We validated them. Both were valid, made some adjustments. So Guatemala. So this tells me that we have to get out and spread risk. I'm an ag econ guy from Purdue. I know you've got a great economics department at UK as well. But I was always taught, and mutual funds tell us the same thing in our investments, that it's usually a good idea to spread your risk. And I think that's what we've got to do. Don't ignore those major countries. They are the bread and butter, and they need our product, and they want our product. But don't put all your eggs in one basket.
You mentioned some countries that we have FTAs with. I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that we only have formal trade agreements with 20 countries. I have nearly 200 on the face of the planet. Any indication that other FTAs may be in the work, and more specifically with countries that have large economies? Japan's the 3rd largest economy in the world, just eclipsed by China. They buy a lot of our pork, they buy a lot of our beef, yet they're in the TPP conundrum. It may be a little reluctant to start a FTA. Any word on that?
Yes, absolutely. There is every intent to do it, and this is one of the directives of the president. I think right now we're trying to settle some of the larger ones. NAFTA would be a very good one. Let's don't forget Korea. Chorus got settled, so check that box, I guess, a bit. We've got to get NAFTA settled, and we can cover that more in a moment. But between USTR, our colleagues there, Greg Dowd is a longtime friend. He's the new ag negotiator. Finally got approved by the Senate. Sharon Bomer, longtime friend. We each came up with our list of countries we want to get after, and the darndest thing, they were almost identical and in almost the same priority. We both agreed we could flip, I think it was the number 2 and 3, and either one would have been pleased with that. But I think the world is waiting to see what's the template that they're going to be dealing with. What am I getting into? And I think they're looking very keenly at NAFTA. How will NAFTA settle? And then they'll have a shape of things to come. And that's fair. There's also a bandwidth issue, I think, at some level with USTR. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in ag trade negotiations and any trade going around the world. So I believe that once we get NAFTA settled, and I hope that that's sooner than later, I think we're going to be able to turn first to Japan and then get on with these other countries. Some visits have already been made very quietly. So we're going to get there.
Well, you brought it up, NAFTA. Right now is a very critical time. There'll be elections in Mexico next month. If something's going to get done, it needs to be done now so that the Senate can consider it. What's the latest? Kentucky is pretty dependent, and in 2 weeks, we'll be leading an agriculture-only mission to Canada. 20% of all agricultural goods from Kentucky travel north to Canada, and we're going to be going up there to work with a farm girl from Glasgow, Kentucky, otherwise known as the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Ambassador Kraft, to make sure Kentucky has a presence up there, that we maintain those relationships. What's your opinion on the status of NAFTA, and what can agriculture gain if a deal is inked this year?
Well, let me first talk about the relationship. We must not let ourselves fall in the trap of saying that there is bad will and hatred between these countries. They are our good friends and our trading partners, and that still stands very strongly. It's a little like when I grew up with a twin brother, an older brother, and then 10 years later, a younger sister. With my brothers and I, of course we love each other, but did we agree with each other on all things? Hell no. We had some knockdown drag-outs at times. And so in a loose translation, I think that that's a little what's going on. If you're wondering whether the president was right to reset NAFTA, the answer is unequivocally yes. First, there is something to say about rethinking these after 25 years, no matter how good it's operating for us. Let me cite 2 chapters that are largely done in the negotiation between the 3 countries. The biotechnology chapter, so think of GMOs, think of gene editing and all those. No such chapter existed 25 years ago. And the language in that chapter would make you smile. It'll sing. And moreover, it will be the template by which we, and I think much of the world, will look at trade agreements, whether it's a bilateral or a trilateral or something like TPP, which has 11, maybe 12. So the biotech chapter has advanced us significantly as a world, not just a selfish U.S. view, the world. The sanitary, phytosanitary chapters, which really get at most of these non-tariff trade barriers, holy smokes, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. It too will be the template by which a lot of discussions will be based. So I think those 2 alone make it worthwhile. So what we're down to is the really difficult stuff. So I think we're going to get there. Now, I don't know that it's going to settle as a threesome. It may be bifurcated and do 2 bilaterals. That's always been in the mix because the issues with Mexico are different than that in Canada. I think it's pretty warm and pretty close with Mexico. This is difficult. I love my friends in Canada. I've worked with so many of them. I mean, who doesn't like a good Canadian? But they are tough negotiators, nothing wrong with that. But they misbehave badly. If any of you in dairy, when they brought that Class 7 milk on, maybe it met the letter of the law in WTO, but it was categorically against free trade. And then to go dump dry milk powder on the world market at something like half or 2/3 the value, not fair. That's worth a timeout or go stand in the corner for 5 minutes. And that's what we're working on with respect to ag. Now, I think most of it's caught up in autos, steel, and aluminum. And so I think Canada's saying, get that out of the way, which is a good negotiating strategy, and then we'll talk about ag. But that needs to be right-sized because our dairy industry, particularly those northern states, are just simply hemorrhaging. We're seeing so many dairy farmers go out of business, not entirely because of that. There's many reasons, but certainly in part because of that. So I think we're going to settle that, and we're going to look back, and we're going to all be friends because we have to be. There is so much trade between our 3 countries that I think it'll end okay. I just hope that they or we, it could be in one of the 3, don't do damage while we're getting there.
Glad you mentioned the dairy issue. Kentucky is not immune from the hemorrhaging that's occurring right now, and we unfortunately have a few farmers that will be adversely affected at the end of this month. Kentucky is also a big automobile producing state, and I know that this is a discussion about agriculture, but these trade negotiations often revolve around settling other industries as well. We export a lot of vehicles. We're the 3rd largest automobile producing state. in the country. But one little unknown fact is that food manufacturing, beverage, processing food, dwarfs automotive and steel production in the United States. We're the biggest. Yeah. We're the biggest. And when we have these disputes between countries, it's important that we have a framework to challenge them. The WTO, we have a trade dispute resolution framework. But one of the things with NAFTA is whether or not there's going to be a Chapter 19 dispute resolution. It's so important that, at least on ag, we have a forum to go to when we do want to call someone's hand on unfair practices. And that's an area that I don't know what this latest status is on NAFTA, and area of concern for us.
Well, I agree, and I too agree that it's a very valuable thing. So I'll just publicly express my view. I do not know if it's in or out. I know there's been a debate on that. You know, this might be, you've got an influential member of Congress or Senate, maybe 2 or 3, that might want to hear that view. But yeah, we got to do it. You know, just to take the larger topic of the WTO, it is so easy to beat up on, and much of it they deserve themselves as an institution, for sure. But my view is we cannot just discard WTO. We've got to modernize it. We've got to bring it into the current day thinking and modernize many things. Because if you don't have rules, all you're left with is the bilateral, what I call a game of whack-a-mole. Just go beat them up. And I suspect we'd fare pretty well there because we're a major country. We've got a presence in a lot of these other countries. But that's no way to run a horse track. So you know, I think we need to work hard on WTO, and we're already working on that. I'm blessed. One of my colleagues in our area of USDA, Jason Hafemeister. If you don't know Jason, his wife is Darcy Vetter, who was the ag negotiator. You talk about the first family of trade. Wow, he was very much at the heart of all the ag creation of the WTO, and I'm thankful he's just down the hall. What a sage advisor. And maybe if he can prevail and others of us prevail, we'll do all right. But yep, we've got to keep WTO. Let's right-size it. Let's don't discard it.
TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. A lot of time and effort went into negotiating a deal. At one point, it had 12 countries in it. It represents 40% of the entire world's GDP. Interesting, in the 2016 election, both candidates came out against it. So regardless of what the outcome was, there was going to be some rough waters ahead for TPP. President has kind of signaled, maybe not so clearly, that there might be an opportunity for the U.S. to maybe re-enter or do some sort of TPP modification. I just wanted to see your thoughts on this. And these are mainly Asian Pacific countries, big areas of growth and countries that need the $140 billion of ag products that we export each year. Thoughts on TPP?
You bet. Well, the president was good for his word. You know, it was only a few days after the swearing in that he stepped out of TPP, so he kept his word. It's a little bit of you say tomato, I say tomato. It's a subjective point of view, and let me explain. The president is absolutely right that the very best way to negotiate a deal is one-to-one. It's a little like you having a 3- or 4-way conversation versus a 2-way conversation. You can dial into the person's interests, their questions, much better one-to-one. That is a true statement. The balance to that, though, is that takes time in a negotiation with a country. So I think the trade-off here is, do you go try to re-enter TPP with 11 countries, and the president's going to need something new. I don't know what that something is, but he's going to need something a little different, and do it that way, or do you take the time that would be required to then negotiate country by country by country? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that. At the time, I thought TPP was pretty good, and I think most of agriculture would say that. And I think Secretary Perdue has encouraged the president to rethink that. I do not have the answer, except to say I hope we flat out get on with it. And that's the disturbing part about NAFTA taking so long, is because I think the intent is once that gets closed, you pivot and look squarely to Japan and then start negotiating there on a bilateral. But, you know, it takes two to tango. And the Japanese understandably were upset. I don't blame them at all. They expended a lot of political capital with their farmers to ascend to agree to the TPP. But at the same time, they also have to know that elections change things. You know, that deal was done under a former president, and here we have a guy that has a different point of view. So I'm not worried that we're going to come to a deal. I was there in the U.S. ambassador's residence in Japan about 6 weeks ago when the new ambassador to the U.S. was introduced. What a great guy. And it was funny, what we would call our Secretary of State introduced him, and he was giving him this very long list of things he had to fix with the U.S. It was humorous. It was effusive. It was joking. And they were doing it right in front of Ambassador Haggerty and me. The relationship is very strong, and it's very warm with the Japanese. And it's not just because the 7th Fleet is sitting out there in Tokyo Bay. It's much more than that. It goes to the heart of who we are. So we're going to get there. I just hope it's sooner than later so that the TPP 11 that's now signed but not active, 6 of the 11 countries have to then have their equivalent of Congress sign on. So it's not in operation yet, but they're all out there playing let's make a deal. So the threat is there. We've got to get NAFTA done and then pivot there either as TPP or a bilateral.
Be thinking about your questions. We'll open it up here in a second. You mentioned earlier some other countries that are not getting the headlines, and you're a baseball guy. You know, you don't have to win a game by hitting home runs every single time. It's the singles and doubles that matter. Talk to us a little bit about your travels. I know that India, big market, competitor too. A lot of permits, a lot of issues there. Other countries that may not be getting the limelight they deserve that we have potential with in terms of increasing agricultural trade.
Yes. Well, that's a great question, and it goes back a little bit to what I was speaking about with Guatemala. First of all, I love the baseball vernacular, but I don't want any country to ever think that they're just a single when they think they might be a home run. But it makes the point here, so let's use it. If you consider countries like China, Canada, Mexico, Japan as your triples or your home runs, we all know that baseball games are won much more frequently by good, frequent singles and doubles than they are triples and home runs. And there are for sure some countries out there that we know, we like, we trade with, but I'm not sure we've really doubled down. So Guatemala was a great example. In no particular order, I'll just list a number of others. Vietnam, whoa, you talk about growth and opportunity. Vietnam is one. The Philippines would be a terrific opportunity. India, now India is going to be a very difficult place in which to do business for a decade or so. But let me remind you, and I see some gray heads like myself out there, some of you probably watched that historic TV coverage when Nixon landed in Beijing, it was Peking at the time, for the historic opening, as they call it, of China. Now how much sales were we doing with China at the time? Very little. Maybe it came through the back door of Hong Kong. And look where we are now. So we need to be a little more like the Chinese in thinking much longer term. I'm thinking long term about India. Now they're going to just bedevil us with their damn tariffs. They're going to throw a tariff up every time a farmer sneezes. But you know, I think I'm betting on the Prime Minister. I think he is trying to reform. When we were there in November, they were so effusive about having moved from 130th on the World Bank's list of countries and the ease of doing business there to 100th. Well, yay! Now, 100th is still so far down in the abyss, it's so dark you can't see it down there, but let's celebrate the movement. I don't think there's ever been a country that moved 30 spots in one segment. I'm betting on India. 1.3 billion people moving into the middle class. First thing you do when you move in the middle class is you start buying food and nutrition for your kids. Education second. In a democracy, unlike a perfect democracy where everybody gets along like we in the U.S., You can't change things overnight, and that's what he can't do, but he is, I think, getting there. So I'm betting on India, despite the fact that we're going to have many, many frustrations over the years. I think some of our South American countries still have great opportunity. I still think there's great opportunity for Mexico and Canada, notwithstanding what's going on here. Asia Pacific is a huge opportunity. I think the UK is a great opportunity. If they, in fact, Brexit, I think it's a great strategic opportunity. In fact, let me speak about Europe. All my heritage, all my ancestors came from Europe, Scottish, Irish heritage. Our loving friends in Europe are in an incredible tailspin on the precautionary principle. Our sales there are pitiful compared to what it should be, and barriers are being thrown up every time you can look around. So I think the UK might be an opportunity if they really do decide to Brexit, and if they really do decide to implement some of their own rules as opposed to wedding themselves in their language and their regulatory profiles to that of Europe. We'll have to see. I'm a little worried about Europe, for their sake, less mine.
You run a large division of the USDA. I think you have offices in 70 countries, I believe.
90, and we
90.
cover 171.
Please describe to us what the Foreign Agriculture Service does, the ATO offices, and for, say, a Kentucky country ham producer, what your staff does to try to get a new product into another country.
Great question. I'm going to talk about two parts. I'll answer the question about the Foreign Ag Service, the people, the structure, and then I want to lift up a program that many of you probably know, the Market Access and Foreign Market Development Funds. So it's very simple. We have staff that are housed in the embassies. In Taiwan, it's the American Institute of Taiwan, because technically we can't have an embassy because we recognize China. That's another story. So we place our people, and they're under the State Department's purview. That's who runs the embassies. But we have anywhere from always have to have an American leading the cause, but we have some of the finest nationals from that country that are there in staff. They are just simply outstanding. And I dare you, if you haven't already, try it out. You're going to find how responsive and how good they are. I love them. I just love them. Depending on the size of the country, the size of the presence will differ. So I'll take China, our largest footprint. Clearly, the minister counselor, the most senior Foreign Ag Service person, is in Beijing, where you need to be, the seat of government. And he's got a staff with, if you include APHIS, which is not my area, or Food Safety Inspection Service, I suspect there's 30 or 40 people right there. But the Foreign Ag Service also have ATOs, Ag Trade Organization offices that are all about trade. We have them in Guangzhou, we have them in Chengdu, we have them in the Northeast. So we have 4 or 5 regional offices. They'll do policy stuff, but they're really all about connecting you and products you want to sell into China with buyers in China. So I said we have a presence in 90 countries, and then they cover a total of 173 countries. So that's the footprint, and they are simply outstanding. Foreign Service officers dedicate their lives to living internationally. Now, they may make a rotation through D.C. now and then. That's part of the requirement. But as long as they're getting promoted, it's like the military. It's up and then out. And at 65, they have to retire. And that's painful. We have some fantastic people who had to retire. So if you have not had interface with Foreign Ag Service people, and if you know Altec and Monica, she's a great testimony to those people. Now, what they do is they use programs that come to us by way of the Farm Bill or just general appropriations that are just magic. The most popular one is the Market Access Program. This is where dollars are created and given to Foreign Ag Service, and then we have office that marries them up. So go down your list. The Soybean Export Council gets some. The corn, it'd be the U.S. Grains Council, not the National Corn Growers, get some. Every commodity you can imagine across the U.S., fruits, vegetables, nut crops, livestock, poultry, every species, every crop, all of them get some piece of those funds, which they then use for their own promotion. Lots of times they'll dedicate some of that back pool it with others and do joint displays. But Congress absolutely loves this program because it's so well leveraged. It's kind of an all hands on the burlap, and it's very, very efficient. And the returns are like 30, 40 bucks to $1 of taxpayer invested. So that's the market access program. Foreign market development program, very similar. I won't go into depth, but those two are the most popular. In times of strife, we also have two capacity building programs. Many of you might know the McGovern-Dole, or in Kansas they call it the Dole-McGovern program. But this is a school feeding program. It largely takes your commodities, ships them down there, converts them into food, and then the kids eat them. And I tell you, it brings tears to your eyes to think about the value of that. We were at a school in the highlands, the western highlands of Guatemala, and I got to serve the rice out of a great big kettle that all the moms and dads fixed. And it just tears you apart to think that a third of those kids, that's their only meal of the day. So I gave an extra helping of rice. So that's that program, and then the Food for Progress program is where we'll take commodities, liquidate them in the country, and then convert those to cash to build programs. And so we visited an incredible fruit cooperative, some vegetables, mostly fruit. And if you don't know it, the Western Highlands is one of the real sources of folks that are heading to the Mexican border, and I don't have to tell you about the consternation that brings. In fact, in a way, it's almost celebrated. They have a statue in the town hall of a guy with a backpack heading north. I'm thinking, oh my gosh. Well, they volunteered. I didn't go there. They volunteered that 30 members of their cooperative are successful now in growing some fruits, largely counter-seasonal to our fruits in the U.S. And those 30 could have been very easy candidates to head north and try to cross the border, maybe illegally, and do all that. So those are the programs, and that's Foreign Ag Service, and they are just flipping outstanding.
You may not know this, but I once interned for the Foreign Ag Service when I was in college.
I did not know that.
I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience here. Yes.
Quarles, I appreciate you being here. One of my interns years ago was Jeff Simmons, and his office up in Atlanta. I have a couple things I just want to make a statement. Immigration, we haven't touched on it. We are in direly need of good immigration workers, and it seems that the workers from the Hispanic countries are the ones that are most available to us. We need help on that. Number two, USDA and all your connections, and I'm thinking specifically with APHIS, we export my company live cattle, Myanmar, Thailand, Mexico. We have problems with people making decisions, yes or no. They don't want to take the heat. They don't want to answer the question. They pass it on. Secretary Quarles knows specifically of a couple examples that occurred here.
Just to clarify, you're speaking of decision makers in the U.S. government, not decision makers in the receiving country.
Yes,
okay.
I can handle that. Kentucky's dairy industry has issues, and I don't think they're going to be solved as far as the milk. But it is a wonderful place to grow heifers. Selling genetics overseas is a wide open market. I've done it for 40 years. So we need to develop, Secretary Quarles, a heifer growing export market. My last statement, and you touched on this some, and you're right on the money as far as Europe. Science has to rule agriculture. The consumer is the tail that's wagging the dog. And we've got to work through that. We've got to explain agriculture. We've got to explain the GMOs, the CRISPR techniques, so they understand it. We're here today because of science, not because what my neighbor thought was good or bad. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this.
Well, on that last point, let's just hear a loud amen. Europe is one of the most beautiful parts of the world that can't compete. And they know it. And so when you can't compete on efficiency, you put up all the barriers. It used to be the Common Agricultural Policy, and then WTO took that out, and so now it's geographical indicators. You can't use the feta or Parmesan cheese name because that came from here. Give me a break. That migrated here decades, if not centuries ago. And we see this time and time. The latest is pesticides. They've forgone risk-based analysis. They're just using hazard, which is no way to characterize it. They've lost half their pesticides over the last 10 years, and they're going to lose 2/3 the next 5. And more so for us is if there's any detect of any pesticide going to Europe, product gets discarded. And when you can start measuring at parts per quadrillion, that's not productive. So, amen and amen on science, and we're talking about that. Couldn't agree with you more on the heifer export market. We're seeing a great deal more. I'm speaking of China more than other countries. I'm less familiar with others, but I'll brief myself. There's a lot of interest in genetics, whether it's live animal or semen, and you're right, there are some barriers. I will take your comment back to our colleagues at APHIS. I have found them to be pretty good, and so I'll challenge and see where that's coming from. I will tell you though, Secretary Perdue he delegates and he holds accountable. And more than once, I've had people look at me with cross eyes when I say, I got your back, go make the decision and get on with it. So I sense that Greg Eibach, my counterpart who led the Department of Ag in Nebraska, Ryan, you know Greg very well, and Dudley Hoskins, his chief of staff, who's the humorous guy from NASDA, it's his chief of staff. I'd be surprised if they're feeling any pain or consternation about making a tough decision and then getting skewered. I'll take that up. On live cattle, well, yeah, I don't know where you ship out of, but I know that can be a point of consternation. Is there a pinch point here?
Well, unfortunately, right now I'm shipping out of Patterson, the old Air Force Base,
Yeah.
Ohio.
Yeah.
And then on ships, we ship out of Norfolk or out of Long Beach.
Right.
Depending on where.
Yep. It's not easy. You got to get one in Lexington. On immigration, that's the big one. Wow, what can I say? We have pushed and pushed. That is so fraught. That is so deep into the political quagmire that something's going to have to happen. Now, I took interest in the paper today that for the first time since they've been recording it, the number of jobs in the U.S. exceeds those who can fill them. Well, that ought to tell you that we need people, right? Or work harder on some of your welfare programs for those that might be able to go back and work, and I'm not going to get into that quagmire, but if there are those that can and should be working, let's get them to work. So I just think this pendulum has to swing a little bit more, painful as it might be. Oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many times Ag has pressed that, and Secretary Perdue has pressed that, and others have pressed that. So it's just caught in the politics, and it's going to have to release sometime. I was encouraged by, oh gosh darn it, I forget which congressman, shame on me, who has a bill more focused on agriculture, and I hope it gets the day of light, but I'm not sure of it. So we're probably going to have to see some more pain before we get that released.
Secretary Will Snell from the University of Kentucky. Thanks for joining us. Probably Commissioner Quarles has told you, we as a state are more trade dependent than most states out there with our diversity of ag products. And you talk a lot about what USDA is doing and lobby organizations and promoting the great story of U.S. export growth. But what advice would you have as a state in terms of export promotion? Commissioner Quarles is very strong on trying to promote Kentucky products, and you've had experience with other states with Indiana. Can you share with us some of the experiences and success stories on the individual state trying to promote?
Yes, I do have some recommendations, and part of this comes from my own experience. I led all the ag economic development in the state of Indiana, in addition to the director of ag role. The first thing is trade missions count. If anybody chooses to challenge the expenditure of monies for that, I hope folks gather at night and threaten these people who are critics, because if you're not there, you're not showing up and you're not counting. Showing up counts. Just ask Greg Eibach on Nebraska beef. Hello. They moved 20, 30 points higher on their export markets just because of some very aggressive and focused marketing. And the way they did it was through my people in the Foreign Ag Service and the market access programs and some MAP funds that National Cattlemen's Beef and the U.S. Meat Export Federation had. So I'd get on those. And sometimes it's with a governor where you're covering other topics. Sometimes you fly solo on an ag mission, but I'd flat get after it. And it doesn't just have to be you. You know, you've got some great talent in marketing. Take some of those folks. So I would recommend that because relationships matter, and more than half the battle is simply showing up, period. That's one. I do think with your members of Congress and Senate reaffirming the value of MAP FMD type funding really is helpful. Oh my gosh. A dollar of taxpayer funds getting $30, $40 in return strictly for ag, that's really cool. So I would say that. Secondly, I know some of the commodity groups are here. I suspect several of you have people on an NCGA or a U.S. soybean board or a USEC council. There's value in there. You know, you can steer things because all these commodity groups are always looking for niche markets. And even corn and soy are finding niche markets. So I think presence on those commodity groups, because they're always taking trips and meeting and greeting and developing. I think you need to really take and I suspect you already have it knowing the quality of this state, get an accurate inventory of all your ag businesses, and I'd beat the living hell out of them to understand there's value in exports. And it doesn't mean you have to expend all your energies, because there is risk if you go all in on a single country. China might be a great example. But boy, there's nothing like spreading the risk. And international trade is not that difficult if you get the right advisors, which Foreign Ag Service can provide, and those, well, like I said, I've referenced Monica several times at Alltech. They know that. It is not that difficult if you have the right advisor, the right coach, and pay attention to them, because there's risks. There's risks. But I would get after it. And I think those are great opportunities. And then always, oh my gosh, I was about to forget this. If you ever thought that quality makes a difference, it does. If we got an issue with a couple weed seeds that China's complaining about in our soybeans. Now, I don't think that's all our fault, because I've pushed back and said, well, if you just approve 6 of the doggone biotech traits you've been languishing on for 6 years, those with their chemistries would take care of those weeds. But I'll tell you, my brother went out since 1996 with a few kids and the hooks and took some weeds out of soybeans so we could maintain a quality product. We must never let quality be forgotten, because the reputation of U.S. quality and safety is paramount. It's just taken for granted. I was in a Costco-like store in Columbia, and the manager of the store was the buyer and the manager of about a dozen of these. So think of the volume he's buying. He talked about anytime they'd put a U.S. product up there, and if it was marked in some way, if there was an American flag or something on it, it wasn't a multi-month run-up. People would start taking it right away because they knew the quality and they knew the safety. So take that and remember that. Those are a few thoughts that I have. But I would say exports, 95% of the country, of the people around the world are outside of our country. If you're not doing exports or learning about it, you're probably missing the game.
Another question. One thing to remember is that you have your trade offices, but we're fortunate in Kentucky to have a presence in 120 countries with Alltech, and so we depend heavily upon them as some extra eyes and ears out there.
By the way, I'm doing my part. Growing up, after I was 21, of course, I had an affinity to the Canadian club, and I have changed. Ryan shamed me mercilessly, and Woodford Preserve is what we have on the kitchen now, so I'm doing my part.
Progress.
Scott Travis, I live below Louisville. I farm mostly grain. I have tobacco and cattle, some vegetables also. I wrote down, first of all, I want to thank you. I have a little more optimism in me by hearing your hopes and your directions of where we need to go. I I agree that's where we need to go, which brings me to my question. One simple word of time. As a farmer, my margins are just so thin. So thin. Like when China slapped that tariff on the sorghum, 178%. If I were a sorghum farmer and I made sales the next day or two, my margin may have been in the red. Not black. So when these discussions are going on, 1 year can kill a farm. So, I know it's going to take time to get the right deal and that'll benefit us, but some of us are going to suffer because of the time it's going to take. What advice would you give us?
Yeah, that's the tough part, and it's the unknowns of when and how a country will retaliate. And the sorghum example was a great one. I don't know how many ships were on the water moving sorghum, but it was dozens. And all of a sudden, they're talking to their headquarters saying, where do I go? Well, I would say that, yeah, we're going to have to strap ourselves in, keep the seatbelt buckled. With China, I'd bring the shoulder straps over and click it twice. But the president said, and I should have probably mentioned this earlier, that if it gets to the point that we're really seeing farmers hurt, we are too, and we have already been planning on mitigation strategies that would protect them. Now, you and I know that government programs are never going to make you a wealthy person, but it'll take that sting out or keep us whole or keep us close to whole. And so we're working on that. And as the issues arise, we didn't have to deal with that. We helped the sorghum producers with some of their legal bills. They took some out of their checkoff, and we helped with some. So we were good for our word. We haven't had to institute any big buys right now, but are prepared to do that if we have to. Now, I don't want to let people think, okay, this is going to help me significantly with my retirement plan, because that's just not the way it works. But it would take the edge off of that till we can get to some point where we see a recovery. The other thing is we just got to keep getting these deals done. Oh my gosh, I'm just beating up, with a smile I do it. I beat up on my friends at USDA saying, let's close down NAFTA, let's get it finished, please get it finished so we can get on to Japanese. Because right now, the analogy is we got a bunch of plates spinning on those poles that you see at the circus or place, and right now there's a lot of plates spinning. And that gives you nervousness and adds some gray hair to both of us probably, and I think we got to let those plates spin, take them down safely, and then just focus on the one or two that are the biggest problems. So I don't have an answer except to say that if that point comes, USDA is going to be there to help you, at least help take the rough edge off of that, and see if we can't get to that brighter day. All I can tell you though, is this. The status quo we cannot sustain. We've been getting screwed for years. The reason my brother had to go out with those kids and pull weeds out of soybeans is because they didn't have 2 or 3 of those biotech traits that China is holding us hostage on. Now that pisses me off. And when we've been wanting and waiting and waiting and waiting on beef access, on the BSE issue of 15 years ago, give me a break. We got to go through this turbulence to right-size this. And so that's where I'm at now, and I'll just tell you, I'm doing everything I can. I've been to China over the last 20 days twice, and I'm leaving for Japan on Saturday. So we're trying to do everything we can to help you. And I would also encourage you, keep us informed. It might surprise you about things you see or observe, because it's your ox getting gored first. You're the first to know, or companies that you sell to are the first to let us know when something nefarious is happening at a port. So not easy for me to say, because it's not my crop, even though we've got interest in the family farm. All I can say is hang with us a little bit, and let's see what we can get done. Wish I could be more promising.
Dave,
I'm Dave Maple of the Cattlemen's Association. You spoke to me pretty straight this morning. But could you recap your visit to China in regards to beef?
Yeah.
And where we are, where we should be?
Yeah, beef was actually a bright spot. Once again, promises made, promises unkept. The promises of the 100-day plan were not completely fulfilled. For sure, some beef made its way there, but the protocol was not completely fulfilled. So we challenged our friends in China, and that's one of the things that I think they're working on and we hope will deliver on. While we were there, one of the things that we've been waiting on is to have 20 beef processing plants have their name rostered on both the Chinese and the U.S. websites. I'm gonna give them credit that in 5 hours they updated their website, as did we.
And one of those were in Kentucky, too,
Hello.
as of yesterday.
I did not know that. So you know, just as I can dish out criticism, I'll dish out compliments that was a change that was made, and let's hope it's sustained. So those kinds of things. And then at some level, tariffs can get in the way. You know, we're not at the same tariff level as Australia, New Zealand, other countries, so we'll have to work on that. But I think the news is probably a little brighter with respect to beef in China than perhaps some other crops. And I'll give credit where credit's due. Yes, sir.
And we are currently working on a possible plan to export beef into China, and we'll be talking about that with you a little bit later today. But in the back, Mr. Pratt.
Steve Pratt with the Burley Tobacco Growers Co-op. By the way, we represent the state of Indiana, also the Burley Growers there. The export market for Burley tobacco is continuing to decline. The import market is doing great. And if you believe Dr. Snell, the cigarette manufacturers use 60% of the burley that they use in the cigarettes today comes from overseas. One of the issues I would like for you to address is the tariff rate quota that was established in 1995, which I would prefer that you go back even before that and re-establish the fact that at that time in the early 90s, cigarette manufacturers were required to use 75% of their product for U.S. domestic grown tobacco. So can you address that?
Well, I'd like to, but I'm not intimately familiar with that. But let me tell you what we are doing. If you haven't noticed it, we're sort of revisiting all the regulations of yesteryear. I think Waters of the U.S. was a very, very big one in a different and unrelated area. But we're also looking hard at all the TRQs because these things need to be updated over a period of time. And we've had inquiries from some of the other crops, I would say mostly those of the California and the Pacific Northwest, where quotas weren't established or maybe need to be updated, and countries that never were producing product X or product Y or product Z are now finding their way to our shores and therefore out competing us because they're subsidized or their labor costs are lower. So let me just promise to take that back because I am not intimately familiar with that TRQ and its operation. I'm sorry.
And as you know, USDA is in somewhat of a pickle when it comes to helping tobacco exports. Since the mid-1990s, when Donna Shalala was Secretary of Health and Human Services, there's been a prohibition on USDA in assisting tobacco exports. So that might be an area where, at a state level, we can be more aggressive on.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a look at anything. You know, the rules are there, and I'll abide by the rules, but sometimes the rules need to be changed. So we'll take that up, and I'm not afraid to take that up.
Sherry in the back.
Hi, Sherry Wilkins with the World Trade Center in Kentucky, and thank you so much for being here. I have learned so much about agriculture in the last year working in the Commissioner's office with the trade mission going to Canada. But I was curious, we did an exploratory mission about 3 years ago with our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Pierce Lyons from Alltech to Cuba. And it was strictly exploratory, as you know. And we found out that 80% of their food is imported. And there are several states within the U.S. that have a large amount of exports that are going into Cuba. I know that's been a subject when we're talking about agriculture. I'd just like to know what you think about that, and do you see that agriculture products being able to be increased into Cuba, or do you see it being mixed altogether?
Well, I'll answer it in two ways. I think when the president probably rightfully opened up Cuba, every state and every ag organization went simply gaga. And good for them. That means they're hungry for new markets. I think it could be a nice market. I don't think it's one of those, using my baseball analogy, a home run or a triple, but I think it's a good market. But our hands are completely tied by the Congress. It is so fraught with politics that until they say we can go do it, we can't do it. The second part, the second answer, is one that's probably borne by the Cubans themselves. I don't know if you heard what was happening to some of the members of the U.S. Embassy there. But I talked to one of our guys who was there. I don't know what the mechanism was. It was not the loudspeakers, but there was some sort of a shortwave or pulsation or some nefarious action going on that was damaging their health. And so they got out. They were ordered out, and rightfully so. And so we don't really have that access. We don't have that ag representation because somewhere somebody was undertaking nefarious actions. So when the Congress says we can go talk and do Cuba, we're going to be happily heading to Cuba. It's that simple.
We have time for 2 more questions. I think you've been having your hand up for a while.
Yeah, Middleton, Hallway Beach here in Lexington. I want to get out of 30,000 foot and get down to 2 feet, something that you can take back from a town hall event like this. And this will be a hindrance to everything discussed today. And from your position, if you could address the electronic logging device that's coming fully in the logistics world. Containers aren't available. We ship to 28 countries out of Lexington here. It's added their cost. It's really a pinch point. I know trucking manufacturing economy is so good. Right now, there's a year plus providing semi get it on the road. It's a big issue, and it can be quite a hindrance to all the discussions we're going to talk about today. And I think with your position, taking that back and tweaking it to some degree, helping realize logistics is part of everything.
Yeah. That's a good point. I am not intimately familiar with that. They'd probably shoot me if I was, because they'd say, why aren't you folks going to trade, young man? But I am aware of it, and I know the Secretary is. So let me just take that point back and say, if it ain't right, get it right. So I think that's the point, yeah.
And
by the way, I know you sell feed into the horse market, right? Yes, sir. Well, we in Indiana are working on ethanol feeding all the Indy cars. So we're very similar, you and I. I like you. We can break bread together.
We have been in communication with Leader McConnell and Secretary Chow on ELDs, and there have been a few extensions, but...
Well, give me the details, and I'll happily take it forward.
Mr. Beck.
Thank you, Commissioner. I apologize. I don't have much of a voice today. I think exactly how far through. Hearing you talk today, and the Commissioner gives us great confidence, one of the expertise, but also the commitment to agriculture. That is so important. Look around this room, you see actors, you see business leaders. It's all of us working together to grow, market, and sell our products around the world. You mentioned the Congress a while ago, and just as a closing comment, I think it'd be helpful for us to take back to our leaders. Your soundbite, your elevator speech. What should we be telling members of Congress? And what should we be telling the public about trade? Help us frame a statement that will be effective when the work that you and others are trying to accomplish on behalf.
Great point. Well, legally, I am not allowed to tell you to go lobby your Congress. But I'll tell you what I tell my wife at home. I tell her if only we had more folks that were, A, sharing their story. I would say, secondly, reminding them that what may seem like a little bit of sales can make the difference between profitability and no profitability, okay? I would be cerebral and fact-based, not shrill. Shrill doesn't work. It might have its place, and I think it did many months ago. It does not now. I think anything that talks about the size. Ryan, I thought your statement was interesting about the size of the ag industry versus the auto industry. Now, I don't want to go compete with autos, but somehow they've caught the fancy of the administration. I don't think we're left behind, but I don't think we're first. So that might help. Well, I also have to say I think we got to ride this out a little bit. I think there are some that just want to say, reel it in, stop this ridiculousness, and let's get back to business. And I'm telling you, getting back to business would not be the way you want your grandchildren to enjoy agriculture. It might be okay for us now, but that slippery slope's getting more slippery and more horizontal or more vertical, and that's not a good thing. So I think showing some support at least for some period of time would be helpful. But mostly it's just go into the facts and say, here's my story. Here's why what we're doing here is so important. Oh, it might help. This is what I tell my wife. I say, Julie, if only I could land some of those plates that I was talking about. If I didn't have to be watching so many to make sure we were keeping them alive, that might help. I think they know that, but it might be reinforcing when you tell your wife that.
One last question. We are at Keeneland. 2/3 of all horses that are exported out of the United States come from Kentucky. We're really proud of that. It's a big industry for us, about $4 billion a year. And Chauncey Morris has a question for you relating to horses.
Mr. Undersecretary, thank you. The comments that you made about MAP, our industry since 2003 have used $1.1 million and parlayed that into close to $1 billion in new sales. Good. And we match that 7-1. But the administration, as it's recalibrating things, will we start to see you making a more public support of those two programs?
I'm not allowed to. I can't be seen as promoting. Now, if I'm asked, I'll answer, of course, but we are not allowed to go out and be advocating for our own programs. I have to leave that to you. But I agree with the thought. And by the way, to your horse question here, I want you to know that I invested $150 for my Kentucky Derby Party event in D.C. You'd be very proud of the fedora that I got, my wife and all her hats and so forth. So we did right, and we had Kentucky bourbon at that event. So I just want to make sure you all make your way to Indianapolis at the end of May, to go see some cars run around the track. How's that for a trade-off?
Sounds like a deal. Undersecretary, thank you for your time. We're glad to stamp your passport with a Kentucky stamp today before you travel the world. And we'll have a few moments if you'd like to talk with him personally. And thank you for your time and commitment towards promoting United States agriculture and putting Kentucky at the top of your list wherever you go. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.